So today's presentation is, as I mentioned, is about fostering belonging for students with disabilities, and it is sponsored by the Progress Center, which is an OSTEP-funded technical assistance center that is part of the the Office of Special Education Programs, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education. The focus of this center is on improving progress and outcomes for students with disabilities. And the center was developed in response to the Andrew F. Supreme Court decision, which states that an individualized education program must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress in light of their circumstances. So that is really the impetus for the work that we do. And the focus of the center is really twofold, working toward an outcome of ensuring free, appropriate public education and access for students with disabilities. So we focus for us first on the development of high quality educational programming, and then also on the implementation of that programming for students with disabilities. And for students to benefit, we understand that these programs must be implemented both with a high degree of fidelity, but also in an appropriate environment. And so that is the focus of today's webinar, which is really on that notion of the school ecosystem, and specifically how we can foster a sense of belonging among all students, and particularly students with disabilities in the school setting. So before we jump in, we wanted to get a little bit more information about our audience. So what is your current role that has led you to join us today? Options are special educator, general educator, administrator, or other. We'll take a moment. And I see a couple of people adding to the chat that they've got some specialists, related service providers as well. We are thrilled to see the range of folks who are here today. So it looks like we're actually settling on, most of our participants are actually people who are sort of fall in that other category. So about 25% are special educators, 20% are administrators, and then the other 55% are in other roles as, again, related service providers, faculty, researchers, doctoral students, and so forth. We do not have any general educators on, unfortunately, today, but hopefully that is an audience we can continue to work to try to engage in this work. So with that, I believe I will stop share. I think I've shared I believe I've just shared the results, but if that did not come through, I apologize. And today, as I mentioned, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Erik Carter, who is the Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Special Education at Vanderbilt University. And he is with us to talk to us about his framework for fostering belonging with students with disabilities. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Carter and let him take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I'm grateful to be with you all and to join you in this very important work of creating communities of belonging for all the students who are part of our schools. So thank you to the Progress Center for your ongoing investment in equipping schools to promote rigor and relevance and relationships for students with disabilities. It seems to me that belonging is all the more likely to be experienced when we address all of these three things together. And so my gratitude also goes to each of you who are joining this webinar, those of you who are teachers and school leaders and professionals, and maybe some parents and service providers as well. But those of you who are coming from all around the country who I know care so deeply about the flourishing of your students. And I know who are also striving to create classrooms and schools and broader communities where students with and without disabilities can really live and learn together in community with each other. Now, that's been the focus of my own work. The last 25 years has really centered on promoting educational inclusion for students with intellectual disability, with autism, and with other developmental disabilities. But I'm really excited to have this time where we can reflect together on what it might look like to move in ways that enable more and more students with disabilities to experience that assurance of belonging in their schools and among their peers. And, I know this is not recipe work, and it's never always that easy to do, but I hope you'll pardon the implied simplicity of my title, 10 Ways Schools Can Foster Belonging Among All Students. So let's go ahead and get started. And I think we can begin by affirming some common ground that we probably all would hold. All of us would probably assert that our schools should be places of belonging for every student. We want our students to feel at home in our schools, in their classrooms, to be real, true members of their schools. We want them to feel valued. We want them to be accepted by their peers and by staff and teachers and others. And most of us strive to create the kinds of connections among students that we know lead to reciprocal relationships and hopefully friendships, lasting, enduring friendships that lead to people's flourishing. Every student should know for sure, for certain, that they belong. Wouldn't you agree? But what does it look like to make that a reality? And you see, we're having this conversation today because belonging can still be so elusive for so many of our students, particularly those who have more extensive support needs. And it can't automatically be assumed, and it's not always experienced. And so often our efforts to foster relationships tend to take a backseat to our focus on academic and behavioral and other kinds of outcomes. And that means that many students still find themselves really on the peripheries of social circles and of school life, maybe overlooked or ignored rather than invited and embraced. So what would it look like to move in ways that change that landscape? And that's where I'm going to park for the next 40 or 45 minutes. And my accent will be on fostering belonging among students with an array of disabilities, including those who have more significant disabilities, but all students. And I think you'll quickly see, though, that the framework that I share actually has relevance to the fostering of belonging for anyone in your school, whether or not they have a disability and whether or not their support needs are more extensive. So I want to set the stage for the conversation with a place that I often begin in talks, and that's by sharing some of the historical context for our field of special education and also for the experiences of those with disabilities throughout really all corners of our society. And I know that some of you have been at this work for a long time. You're special education directors, your principals, and this is common knowledge for you. But I think for those of you who are newer to the field, this might be insightful to think about how far we've come, but also to look backwards on where we've been and how our own schools now might fall within the stream of educational history. I think when we look backwards at history, it gives us a hint of where we might go next as well. So I'll use my own lifespan, I guess, as a time frame to talk about this. My kids tend to say I'm old, and of course I vigorously protest that. And then they remind me that I was born way back in the 1900s, and I, of course, have to relent at that point. So I was born in the early 1970s, and that was a time when so many students with disabilities found themselves excluded from public education. And not just our schools, but so many other opportunities that existed throughout our communities. Before Public Law 94-142, if we think about the circles on the screen as being members of a particular school or a type of community, maybe yours, we'd say that there were holes at that time, and many students with disabilities were missing from so many communities that were important to be part of. Of course, so many of advocacy efforts and laws were passed, school reform efforts were undertaken throughout the 70s and the 80s, the times I was going to elementary school and middle school and high school. And as those new policies and practices were pursued, what we found is that so often opportunities that emerged for students with disabilities, particularly those who had developmental disabilities, tended to be offered in largely segregated contexts, really apart from any other student who didn't have a similar label. And that's a strong word, but I think it's fitting for the prevailing models of schooling at the time. They were segregated. Special education schools, for example, and those students graduated so often then to specialized day programs or sheltered workshops or institutional living for adults with disabilities. What it meant was that for many students, maybe most students without disabilities, they were growing up and receiving their formative education in the absence of their peers with disabilities. And consider what that means for communities and civic groups and corporations and congregations that those peers will eventually lead if they are growing up and learning in a context that doesn't include those with disabilities. Well, over time, fortunately, the landscape began to change even further. And as we look at the 80s and the 90s, so much of the efforts then were towards ensuring that students with disabilities were really integrated, or we sometimes talked about mainstreamed within the ordinary aspects of their school and also community life. And it was incredible progress and important progress. But what we often saw when we looked more closely at what happened within our schools is that there was still a certain kind of separation that existed, different classes down a rarely traveled hallway. As we looked in our communities, large group homes tucked into untraveled parts of town, work enclaves that put people with disabilities near but not really among their peers without disabilities. And that preposition is important, near but not really among other people without disabilities. And the distance between those two words and those prepositions is much larger, more substantial than we often think. And that takes us, of course, to now, the present day in this historical progression, where I think we'd often talk about our national emphasis as really ensuring that students with disabilities are part of the same ordinary activities as anyone else in their community, in the same classrooms and clubs, same jobs or congregational activities, the same community groups as anyone else. That's been the theme of the last 2 decades of inclusion. And it's really, as I said, a movement of prepositions. It's moving from being apart from one another to being among one another to now being with one another. And that preposition really does make, I think, all the difference. So you start to look at the screen and you see very different portraits of schools, very different portraits of community reflected in these images. And I share them for a number of reasons that I think are really important to key in on. The first is that what you see on your screen isn't actually a historical portrait of where we've been. It actually reflects a present day portrait of where we are right now. I don't know what cities or states you're in right now, but you can find examples of schooling marked by each of these portraits side by side in almost any community. And the second thing I wanted to emphasize is I think these portraits prompt our reflection as we start to think about the schools we work in or the schools that we lead or that we support through our professional work. It causes us to ask ourselves which of these portraits resembles most closely what we see right in front of us. Is it a portrait of segregation or integration or inclusion? And why are we stuck sometimes where we are, and what should really be our next destination as we think about moving forward? But the primary reason that I share these images is I think there's one more image that's missing, a more enticing destination, maybe if you think about this as a journey that we're trying to move through. There's another goal perhaps that we ought to have in mind. When you spend time talking to students with disabilities and you talk with their families about what matters most, I think what you start to discover is that people want to be more than just merely integrated, and maybe even more than simply included. They talk about wanting to experience belonging, right? We all want to belong. And how might that be depicted visually? Well, I think it means that we've come to see each other in our community in fundamentally different ways. Our vantage point changes, our perspective changes. It's not that there are some people who are labeled and those that are the labelers or unlabeled. It's not the members and the strangers, the ins and the outs. We start to see our school or our community as filled with diverse students, absolutely, but each person as having equal and immeasurable worth. That's one part of it. Belonging is about how we see one another, but it's also about how we share our lives together. It's not merely about sharing space, which is so often what we mean when we talk about integration or even inclusion, though it shouldn't be. But we also start to think about sharing our lives, that we become intertwined in some way, woven together with one another. And kids and adults remain involved in each other's lives after the school bell rings or after we clock out of work, all 7 days of the week. It's moving from living parallel lives to actually living and learning in community together. So I think there's a difference here in these portraits between inclusion and belonging, for example. We might talk about that as the difference between being present in a place and actually having a presence in that place, or the difference between welcoming students' presence in all you do, in your class, in your clubs or others, and actually missing them when they're not there, or aching in some way because of their absence. Belonging matters, and it's this destination of belonging where I want to park the rest of my time as well. So how might our schools become places marked by belonging for all of our students, but particularly for students who so often have felt excluded or been excluded? What does it mean to belong? And I think this is something we can all connect to. And in fact, I'd like you to find your chat box right now and help me out with this, because we know firsthand the joy of experiencing belonging, and we know viscerally what it feels like when it doesn't. But it keeps coming back to the question of, how do we know we belong? And so I'd ask you to fill in the blank. Think about a place where you belong and fill in the blank. I know I belong when. How would you finish that sentence? And I'd like to see the chat box light up a bit with some of those answers. When people are visibly happy because I'm there, I love that. When people welcome me, wonderful. When I'm safely can be me, I feel safe, I'm accepted, I'm invited to places, I'm known. When people actually make eye contact and smile, right? When people talk to me, when I'm missed, right? That's often the marker of belonging, is when you're missed, right? I see many others coming in, so keep adding those, because I think thinking about how we might experience belonging provides us a good lens to think about how our students might experience that as well, right? I mean, belonging is something that it's easy to affirm, it's a little harder to define. And so it raises the question, what does it mean to belong? How do we know when we've arrived in that destination? Well, that's the question that's cut across so much of my own work that I've been involved with, and I bet it's the work that you're involved in too, right? What are the things that tell us students belong? And that might give us guidance on what we might do differently to make sure that becomes a reality for more students. So research and practice provides a lot of valuable insights into what leads to belonging. And I'm not here to offer the definitive word on the subject, but I do want to draw from a large collection of observational studies of classrooms and lunchrooms, from scores of interviews we and others have done with students and families, from quite a number of intervention evaluations and a number of literature reviews that we've been involved in over these last 2 decades. And from that work, 10, I think, essential dimensions of belonging for students with disabilities seem to emerge as having salience for our work as school leaders and as teachers. Here's what we've heard and seen and learned through this work. To belong is to be present. It's to be invited, to be welcomed, to be known, to be accepted, to be supported, to be heard, to be befriended, to be needed, and to be loved. And I think when each of these areas is addressed well, then schools are much more likely to be learning communities where students with disabilities thrive and come to be seen as indispensable members of that community. So let me share in each of those areas what I think they mean and why they might matter. And in a few cases, I'll share some snapshots of studies that I think speak to these facets of belonging. But the real point is to prompt you to reflect on the schools that you're part of. And so ask yourself, as I walk through each of these 10 areas, what are we doing really well right now in our own school? We want to keep doing those things. And are there things you hear that maybe we could be addressing better or more of, or even entirely different? And what might next steps be for us if this is a vision that we want to see embodied in the life of our school? Because these are things that are not happening often in widespread ways, and they cannot automatically be assured. So let's start with presence, because I find that belonging almost always begins with presence. It's built on this shared foundation of shared experiences and repeated encounters over time. To be present is just to be involved in all the ordinary activities within and beyond the classroom that anyone else might be part of in your school. It's about being part of the everyday fabric of everyday school life, just like anyone else. because it's hard to feel like you belong if you're rarely or ever part of the activities and the events that make up a community, from the outside in some ways looking in. And so students with and without disabilities should be participating together in the same classrooms and hallways and playgrounds and cafeterias and clubs to encounter one another as they learn and as they play and as they relate to one another. In other words, the presence of students with disabilities, including those with more extensive support needs, should be really a natural and expected part of everyday school. And so it prompts our reflection. If we think about the fact that 1 in 7 kids typically in our school has a disability in some way that impacts their learning or their relationships, it starts to prompt us to think, what would a peek into our classrooms or our cafeterias or our courtyards or those extracurricular clubs say about the presence of students with disabilities in the activities that make up our school? Are they on the peripheries of what we offer? Are they at the center? Or are they somewhere else altogether? And obviously, for some students, the impact of that disability will be quite substantial and very apparent. For others, it will be less visible or only evident in certain areas. But that 15% of students, as Anne asked, 1 in 7 is about 15% in most schools. Now, we do have some data that speaks to presence. Most of the school day for students is spent in a wide range of interesting academic, elective, maybe related arts classes. Now, we don't actually have data on whether those classes are interesting, but let's hope they are. But we do have data on whether students with disabilities are taking those classes alongside their peers. And what we find that when we look at our national data, absence from general education classrooms still is more common than presence in those classrooms. So on the screen, you'll see the percentage of students with various disabilities who are placed nationally in, when you look national standpoint, those receiving services under IDEA who are served in different settings: intellectual disability, blindness, multiple disabilities, autism, emotional behavioral disabilities, and then the last column, all disabilities. So what you see on your screen is the percentage of students who are in entirely separate schools or other settings outside of their local public school. For some disability categories, that's a large percentage. I'll add on top of that the percentage of students who spend the majority of their day in typical schools outside of general education classrooms, mostly special education classrooms, resource or self-contained classrooms. And you start to see that for some disability categories, that reflects more than half of all students who have limited presence in the same classes alongside their peers without disabilities. The remaining 2 bars of yellow are the percentage of students who spend a mix of time in special and general education classrooms, 40 to 80% of their school day. And the last column is those who spend almost all of their day, 80% or more, in general education classrooms. For students with more significant support needs, you find that even more of their day is spent not being present alongside their peers. It's actually fascinating when you look at state by state variations in these data. For example, there are wide variations in placement from one state to the next. What I've put on your screen is the percentage of students with intellectual disability, who are often the least likely to be included, who are spending at least 40% of their day to 100% in general education classrooms. It ranges from 20% in one state all the way up to 80% in another state, and everywhere in between. And it drives us to realize that maybe it's not just child's needs that's driving where students spend their school day. Maybe there's an aspect of educator expectations or attitudes or capacities or other things that drive where students are and are not present. For those of you who are thinking about the wide range of students with disabilities, there's the same variations when we look at students across disability categories who are spending almost all of their day, 80% or more included, but you still see variations. My point in all of this is that it should prompt us to reflect on what might be standing in the way of presence in classes and clubs and cafeterias and other aspects of our school. What might be barriers that we need to break down? Is it barriers related to awareness or training or expectation or attitude? Do we think it's barriers of finances or resources or staffing models, barriers of commitment or even values? Presence is important. It's the baseline for belonging, but I would argue that it's the starting point for it. It's not the destination. It's not enough, and we have to press deeper. So reflect in your own school or your district. Are students involved in all of the same places and programs and activities as their peers? What might it look to do to respond to that differently if the answer is not very often? Well, the antidote to absence is often invitation, and invitations are powerful, right? To be invited, to be pursued. There's something really, I don't know, just powerful about being picked by someone else, or wounding about not being picked. And so it's so encouraging for students to know that others want to be in their midst, that their company is desired or even needed, which is a later dimension of belonging. So I think such an experience like that really sends a powerful message to kids with disabilities that we want you here, we need your presence. It just wouldn't be the same without you. And so we would hope, and we should work towards having invitations that abound for students with disabilities in our schools. That might involve peers, being asked by peers to sit together at lunch, to collaborate on a project, to join in games together at recess, to come after school to a birthday party, or even be part of a sleepover. Those invitations are a indication of belonging. And yet those invitations, we know, are still rare for many students that we serve in our schools. I want you to consider some data from the National Longitudinal Transition Study 2, which took place in the United States a number of years ago. They found that half of all teenagers with autism had not been invited to any other social activity by another youth in the last 12 months, 51%. The same was true for nearly 1 in 4 youth with intellectual disability, and you can see some of the other disability categories as well. The numbers are quite a bit less in the elementary school, but actually not substantially so. And so we hope that students are invited by their peers, but also that they're invited by teachers, invited to join extracurricular clubs, to attend field trips, to contribute on service projects, to take part in leadership roles or other school activities. Belonging ends up beginning when those powerful invitations that we've talked about become everyday occurrences, not just from peers, but from teachers and from others at the same school. So when we say everyone is welcome, we often think that is an invitation, but we have to mean that. I think we often have the language down. Everyone's welcome. We mean really everyone should feel like they're part of this place or present in what we do. But it's hard to mean that sometimes, actually. And there's a difference between announcing that you're welcoming and actually inviting people to be part of what you offer as well. An invitation is very personal, and an announcement's not. An invitation says, I'm thinking about you. I want you to be part of this club. I want you to be part of this group. The announcement always leaves open the possibility that there's a footnote or an asterisk or some kind of qualifier like the question mark in this graphic that makes people wonder whether you really mean kids with disabilities or you really mean kids with significant support needs. We want our invitations to come without asterisks. We want them to abound. And so we might reflect on how we're doing in our schools and making sure those invitations are extravagant and extended to all of the students who are part of our school. Well, third, we learned that belonging involves being welcome. It's the way that students are greeted and treated by others. That says a lot about your place in the community, and it's to be received with warmth and friendliness and an authentic delight. It's about when people find pleasure in your presence. And so, we so often find that people want to be welcoming, but they're uncertain about what to do or what to say or how to do that really well. And we often see that when kids or even staff are hesitant or reluctant, they tend to avoid. Right? That's our go-to posture when we're uncertain about what to say or do. And that avoidance leads to people not feeling very welcomed. Now, there's also ways that we often go about including students in general education classrooms that often makes it feel difficult to be welcomed or feel welcomed. Think about when kids arrive or when they leave class, or who they sit near or who they don't sit near in class. The data on your screen aren't the same as being welcomed, but I think they impact it. We did an observational study of inclusive classrooms for 108 high school students with intellectual disability. And we observed for 3 class periods from the beginning of the class to the end of the class. That's what you see along the bottom of the screen. And we just tracked when the students arrived to class, and when they leave, and we tracked who they were sitting next to and whether they were anywhere near their peers. And what you see is that students with disabilities, particularly those with extensive support needs, often arrived late to class. They often left early from class, and they were only there for about 84% of the class. And likewise, when they were in the classroom, they were often sitting next to adults, not next to other kids. In fact, they were in proximity to other kids without disabilities, only about 42% of the inclusive class. And so it's hard to feel welcomed, to interact with other kids if you're not sitting near them, or you're coming early or arriving late. It reminds me of a study from nearly 30 years ago by Robert Schnorr called Peter, He Comes and Goes. It's the idea that some students are part-time members of general education classrooms. Some come late, some leave early, some are there only for the middle, some never arrive, and some come and go as they do therapies and other sorts of things. We want to make sure that students feel welcomed in their classes and in their schools. And that comes when other people greet them and strike up conversations and sit with them at lunch and ask about their day, join them in shared activities, or remember their birthday, or just notice when they're not there and follow up to find out why. Those are ordinary gestures that communicate that you're welcome, that people have authentic delight in your presence. And the great thing about being welcomed is that when you feel welcomed, that elevates kids' enthusiasm for learning. It solidifies their membership. They want to come to school more when hospitality abounds. And when it's absence, they feel uncomfortable or maybe don't want to come at all. So this sense of being welcomed is often communicated through those kinds of gestures, ordinary gestures of peers and staff that I mentioned. But it also means that staff may need some guidance on how to engage with students who communicate differently or require ongoing assistance or who behave in unfamiliar ways. We may need to provide guidance on how to talk about disability in respectful and relevant ways, or how to design our classrooms and instructional spaces with a broader range of students in mind. That might lead to more and more students feeling welcomed and actually being welcomed as all. So the fourth aspect of belonging involves being known, and kids love to hear their names, don't they? Right? Whether that's shouted across a room, uttered from the other end of a phone, called out across the cafeteria, we all long to hear our names. It reminds me of the old sitcom Cheers, right? We all want to go where everybody knows our name, where everybody's glad we came. And I think the joy of being known is really a part of belonging. It's being noticed and recognized, being understood deeply and personally. And so having relationships with people who understand you and affirm you, that's an important part of belonging. And yet so many students with disabilities can sometimes feel like strangers in their own school. They spend their day in separate classrooms or on the periphery of school activities. And what happens is the opportunities to develop relationships with other kids or other staff just become more limited. So whether students with disabilities are known is an important part of belonging, but what we found is that it's how students are known that matters just as much. And I think it's worth reflecting on the labels that we often attach to our students, to categorize them, to diagnose them. We often define based on struggles rather than strengths. We define based on challenges rather than contributions. We define by deficit. That's how our diagnostic labels are often attached. But I think this has implications for how we think about belonging. When we only know students in terms of their labels, or kids only know them in terms of their disabilities, we sometimes flatten the portraits of how students are known. It's equally true, I'm sure you would all argue, that students with disabilities also have incredible strengths and talents and personalities and interests and character that are exciting to get to know, just like anyone else. And so there is a different way to know students by their strengths and their passions and their positive qualities that remind us they're indispensable, they're not incapable. And so how can we come to think about students with disabilities first and foremost as having strengths and contributions and gifts to be received? What are the kinds of assessments we're using that reveal those things about our students as much as they reveal about the instructional and other needs that they have as well? I think this strengths-based stance is really consistent with how so many families describe their daughters and sons and siblings with disabilities. And so schools that are committed to belonging always seek to understand each student's interests and passions and skills and talents. And as they come to know those and share those out with others, then others are better positioned to support and befriend and lead those students well. So again, it's a place to reflect and think about each of these goals. Well, fifth, it's one thing to be included, it's another to be accepted. And when we talk with families in our projects about the markers of inclusion for their children with disabilities, they often talk about their daughters and sons being, and these are the quotes we hear, welcomed without condition, treated like family, embraced for all of who they are. Those ought to be the things we hear from families over and over, but they're not always what we hear from families over and over. Attitudes towards disability have certainly changed dramatically, but I think we're a long way still from that assurance of acceptance. The same stereotypes or stigma that exist outside our schools exist in our schools. And it's evident still in the stories families share with us and the quotes that they tell us about belonging and inclusion in their own schools that you see up on your screen as well. Schools are these rare communities where all kinds of different kids come together from different backgrounds. And so it's a chance for them to learn alongside and play alongside each other, to encounter kids who have characteristics or experiences or life circumstances that are just different from their own. And so promoting acceptance within this diversity is really central to belonging. So I think this is where we have to think about how we shift attitudes of others. It's not always easy, it's long haul work, but we actually know something about how to change attitudes. We know there's a place for sharing accurate information or providing awareness and education training around disability. We can host activities for our students and staff or families that raise understanding and awareness. We know there's power in what we model and the stories we tell. And we know that when we hold high expectations and use affirming language and support shared activities, that attitudes start to change. But I want to emphasize, and this goes back to one of the comments around social IEP goals, one of the primary ways to change attitudes is connecting students to inclusive experiences and fostering relationships. It gives kids with and without disabilities a chance to meet one another, to learn about each other, to challenge their preconceived ideas about one another. In other words, real acceptance doesn't come from learning about someone with a disability or about someone with autism, but from coming to know someone personally. That's when those preconceived ideas so often get overturned. Well, that takes us to the sixth dimension of belonging, which is support. And we know that's so critical, that our true capabilities aren't evident really in what we do on our own, but rather by what we do when we're given the right opportunities and supports. And so to be supported is about having the individualized support students are going to need to be part of all of those activities that we offer. Students with disabilities often need additional support, right? In the form of academic assistance in certain classes or social supports during non-instructional times, behavioral supports across the school day, emotional supports as a form of care. And for some students, that support will be modest and maybe episodic, but for others, it's going to be substantial and it's ongoing. It's the provision of that individualized support that becomes this tangible demonstration of the school's commitment to their educational flourishing. It communicates a desire for their presence, and the absence of support is what so often leads to exclusion or limits meaningful participation. So we have to see that individualized support as being our core commitment, not an optional endeavor. And so this is the place for asking good questions, for doing good person-centered planning that's individualized, that's contextualized, so we figure out what supports a particular student will need to be part of the things that are important to them in their school. And it also means we have to build the capacity of our staff to support students well in classes and programs and clubs and field trips. And also to think about how we engage peers as natural supports to their classmates who might need extra help. I want to emphasize here that caution is sometimes warranted when we think about support. When we think about belonging, so often we think the best supports are those that are provided by adults or professionals. And there's certainly important supports we provide as adults, but we're prone so often to surround students with paraprofessionals or special ed staff or related service providers, sometimes to the near exclusion of peers. And I think that's where we have to be really careful. If you walk into most schools now, you'll find there are often more paraprofessionals than there are certified special education teachers. That's the green line that's on the graphic right now that you see, that's increasingly going up and up and up as the number of certified special ed teachers is stagnating or staying similar. There's a risk we run sometimes when we rely so heavily on adult supports. It's when we inadvertently crowd out peers and we overlook other kinds of more natural sources of support as well. One of the things that my research team has really focused on is evaluating 3 very practical ways of involving peers in supporting students with disabilities in inclusive classrooms, but also in cafeterias or extracurriculars or community activities. These are really just peer-mediated approaches that go by different names depending on the setting. The thing is that in our research, almost every single study we've conducted, we found noticeable advantages when students with disabilities receive support from same-age peers without disabilities versus working exclusively from paraprofessionals or adults. And so the question is, how are we engaging our peers and other students in these kinds of ways as well? And so we don't want IEPs that say a student should be close to their teacher, as you see in the Q&A box, but ones that actually think about how teachers and paraprofessionals can be facilitators to shared work and social relationships with other kids in their classrooms as well. Well, that takes us to number 7. It's to be heard, and everyone wants to feel listened to and understood and respected. I saw this in the answers that you put in the chat box just a moment ago as well. There's something about knowing that your voice is valued that's empowering, but it also helps you feel more connected to one another. So to be heard is really to have your perspective sought out and listened to and respected. And amplifying the voices of students with disabilities ends up promoting their self-determination, enhancing their self-worth, and contributing to their sense of belonging. I think there's a sense that when students feel heard at their school by adults and by peers, it reminds them that they're important and that their voice matters, that they have ideas to contribute, that they have a seat at the table, that they're valued. And that's important because I think so often we don't think about seeking out the perspectives of students with disabilities, particularly those with more extensive support needs. But we know that best practices say kids with disabilities should have a say in all aspects of their lives and their learning. So how might we equip students to be more self-determining, to make their own choices, to know their strengths and needs, to advocate for their needs, to set their own goals and to work for them, and to communicate those goals and needs to others effectively? That's part of equipping our students to be self-determining. And it's something that happens at school, but it also is something that we want to advocate for at home as well. I put on your screen, and there'll be in the handouts a free guide that you can share with families about how they might promote those kinds of skills that enable students to have their voices heard, to make choices, to make decisions, to set goals, and to advocate for their needs. It's completely free and might be something that you share with families as they think about what they might do at home as well. Well, 8th is to be befriended, because belonging is so rooted in relationships. It's about having people in our lives who know us and like us and miss us and love us that is at the heart of our well-being. And of course, that's true for students with disabilities too. They also have the same desire for friendship and other supported relationships. Absolutely. It's grounded in this core belief that we thrive most in community. And we want to make sure that every student has someone in their life who says, I choose you too, as a friend. So friendships contribute so heavily to our well-being. They give us meaning. They make us who we are. They help us navigate challenges. They bring us joy. It's just not good to be alone. And I think that, when you think about the other 7 dimensions of belonging I've talked about, those can also, I think, often be addressed kind of at arm's length, right? You can do them in the absence of close relationships. You can accept someone, you can welcome someone, but friendships take belonging much deeper. And it's those friendships that are so often elusive for our students. We often talk about this sort of circles of relationship for our students. We think about the people in our own lives, for example, who we would name who are important to us. Family members, for example, friends and close companions. we have acquaintances, we have professionals and paid supports in our lives. All of us on this call have lots of names that we would put up on these different circles, in those circles of family and friends and neighbors and teammates and classmates and people paid to be part of our lives, our bosses, our auto mechanics, our doctors. We also want names to abound for students with disabilities, but to abound in all of those different circles as well. And yet when we take a close look at some of our students, we see lots of students who have names in that circle of family and friend or family members, or in that circle of paid staff and supports, but very few names that show up in the circles of friends and close companions or club mates and teammates. This isn't just anecdotal, the data bear this out. That same national study that I mentioned earlier shows the percentage of students who never or rarely receive phone call from friends, or who never get together with friends outside of school in the last 12 months. And the numbers are high for many students with disabilities as well. So we want to make sure we're intentional about fostering friendships, that those become part of what we work towards alongside academic and behavioral outcomes. We want to make sure that when we think about any student in our midst, that there are a lot of peers that we can name who she can eat with and walk with and celebrate with or cry with, play with or pray with or shop with or catch a movie with or just hang out with and watch the Super Bowl with, right? And I know I ended all those with prepositions, which is frowned upon, but you get the point. I just think that relationships have to be a marker, a key marker of any experience that we label as inclusive or we call inclusion. It's not inclusive education if there's no one in that class who knows her name. And it's not really a learning community if some students are always on the outside of that learning. So how do you introduce relationships into the picture? It's not recipe work, as we said before, but there is sort of a formula to it. It's not perfect, but we know that most friendships among kids, even among adults, happen through shared activities around common interests with sufficient support over time. That's kind of a recipe, right? When kids spend together in shared activities, time together in shared activities around common interests, and they do that over time, it turns out that they start picking one another as friends. And so we want to make sure as teachers that we are making sure every student is receiving the invitations and the support they need to be part of all the activities that we offer in our school. We want to deepen our commitment to inclusive activities that exponentially expand the opportunities that students with and without disabilities have to meet one another and discover those shared interests and friendships. And then we want to find out what students' interests and hobbies and passions are and try to facilitate introductions to other kids who share those same things in common. And of course, the more we can use peer-mediated support models that invite and equip and assist peers to provide some of that support, that also helps as well. But I think this also has implications for how we think about programming related to people with disabilities. If our main models are separate or segregated, then the opportunity to be chosen as a friend becomes more limited. And just as important, the opportunity for other peers to encounter all of the enviable qualities of students with disabilities, that also becomes limited too. And that leads, of course, to the 9th dimension of belonging, which is to be needed. And the richest form of communities are marked by a real reciprocity. We see every student as having skills and talents and strengths that can benefit others and benefit the larger community. So we want to make sure that every student is valued by others and considered an indispensable member of the community. We know that every student in our midst has immeasurable worth, but we also know that not every student in our midst feels valued. And it's not uncommon for some students with disabilities to feel less needed than others, particularly students with developmental disabilities who are often seen as the ones who need support or assistance from others. Rarely do we acknowledge them as students whose presence and contributions enrich and even enliven the learning community. So we want to find ways to connect students with disabilities to valued roles in their school and in their community. Because when we do that, the ways they're viewed by others starts to change. How do we connect them to volunteering, to taking on leadership responsibilities, giving them opportunities to help others in need, to participate in high status activities, to assist on important projects in the classroom, to have a role on a team, or to contribute in any number of ways. It's that shift from being just a recipient to a contributor that so often brings a sense of significance and importance. And you all nailed this in the chat just 40 minutes ago. When others come to need you, your absence is missed. And when you're missed, that's when you can be absolutely certain that you belong. Well, the 10th dimension of belonging is one that we don't talk a lot about. And it's the area of just being loved. You know, people go to incredible lengths for those that we love, don't we? We make allowances, we go the extra mile, we sacrifice our interests, we avoid doing just what's expedient or minimal, we work for people's good. And it's that love for one another that compels us to invite and to welcome and to know and support and care for and befriend kids with and without disabilities. When people talk about the communities that matter most to them, including schools, they talk about the love they encounter there. And where love abounds, that's where we find that belonging is much more likely to be experienced. But we don't talk a lot about love in the professional literature. It's not an evidence-based practice as far as I've read. We don't see it in our policies and practices. We don't touch on it in our trainings. I just don't think that should mean that it's irrelevant. It's central to belonging. And if you know the work of Wolf Wolfensberger, he once said that healing for wounded people with disabilities begins with 3 messages. You are valuable, you're as valuable as any other person, and you're loved by those around you. So we want to make sure that kids with disabilities, they yearn to be part of a school community where they can love and be loved, and we want our communities to be places that are marked by that. So that's the portrait of belonging that emerges from the vantage point of students with disabilities. It's what we hear from families and schools and others who've been part of our project. And that's the 10 ways that we should be thinking about in our own schools. Are kids with disabilities actively and personally invited? Are they present in all of what we do in the life of our school? Are they experiencing a warm welcome whenever they arrive? Are they well known by their peers and their teachers? Are they accepted without condition, without caveat? Are they provided the support they need to participate fully and meaningfully? Are they asked to share their perspectives, to have a voice? Are they developing and deepening relationships with other kids all throughout their school? Do we see them as needed and absolutely indispensable to the thriving of any community? And are they loved deeply and unconditionally? What are we doing well in each of these areas so that all of our students experience these things? And what could we be doing better or more of or differently? These are not needs that are specific to kids with disabilities. These are universal needs, not special needs. And I wonder how we might move differently in our schools when we start to view these as key practices and postures that we want to make sure we are adopting. So I hope you are seeing each of this journey, I guess, as you might say, of belonging as one worth pursuing in your school, as one worth reflecting on in your school, because there's a lot of action to take to move us further along in this journey. And I hope this gives you at least a snapshot of things that you might do in your own communities to live out each of these and make them more a common experience for students in your schools. So let me close my portion of the talk by just thanking you for the work you're doing in each of your schools to transform the lives of kids with disabilities in their learning, but also in their social relationships, and for your commitment to becoming a school marked by inclusion and belonging for everyone. I think this is at the core of what we're called to do. It's why we got into this field. It's the work that matters most. And I love knowing that there are allies and partners and advocates in this work as well. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. At this point, we would love to open up to questions, and we have had several good ones come in through the Q&A. So I will start with the first one, which is that in my experience, middle and high school students do not want to be served in front of peers. How do you serve in general education when the kids don't want or refuse the service?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what they're referring to in terms of services necessarily, but we often think about, I think there's a promising place for some of our peer-mediated approaches to engage peers sometimes in thinking about ways that some of the kinds of services or supports that we're hoping that we know students will need to be part of the class can be delivered. And so, for example, rather than having the paraprofessional be the direct support to the student with disabilities, many of the models that I've advocated and put links to in the handouts pull that paraprofessional back as a facilitator to support the student through their work with shared experiences with other peers. So rather than writing that paraprofessional into the IEP as a one-to-one to the student, it's making sure that paraprofessional is in that classroom and supporting that all students in that class with a particular eye to making sure the student with disabilities is getting the direct services that they need as well.
Thank you. Another question is, I am curious about students with disabilities who attend a school that exclusively serves students with disabilities. I would imagine that they generally feel a sense of belonging. I would also think that they struggle with their need to belong if they attend a college that does not exclusively serve their population. Is there any research on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know of research that really focuses particularly on special education schools in particular. I wouldn't doubt that students can feel a great sense of belonging in lots of kinds of communities. We find that also that students feel, talk about deep sense of belonging when they're in groups that also include other individuals who have similar labels. I think that the way we want to expand that perspective is that when we have exclusively those kinds of models of support, that it inadvertently means lots of other kids in our community, in the communities that those students will graduate into and hopefully work and live and worship and live in, that those students end up missing the opportunity to belong in relationship with kids with disabilities. So I don't know a lot about, I don't know that there's research particularly on how various settings necessarily contribute to or detract from belonging, but it does limit the opportunities when we think about who the student belongs to, what group they have that opportunity to belong to as well.
Thank you. Another question that has come in through the participants is, how do you suggest we move away from the overuse of paraeducators in our school?
I think this is a real challenge because paraeducators are so often requested by families and by general educators as a direct source of one-to-one support. I don't advocate for less paraprofessionals in our schools. I advocate for a different way of thinking about how those paraprofessionals are involved in supporting learning, that we're not thinking of them as the exclusive or primary source of support. So I think for schools, it means one is we have to sort of give permission to paraprofessionals to let them know that if you are facilitating independence and connections to kids, that doesn't mean you're not doing your job if you're able to fade back that support. In fact, it might actually be the very marker that you're doing that work very well. It also means we need to provide training to gen ed teachers and others as well about different models of support. Peer support arrangements, for example, in general education classrooms, peer network interventions that take place outside of the classroom that bring peers in as primary supports to students, which don't eliminate the need for paraprofessionals, but shift them back to this more background facilitator role. So I think a lot of folks haven't thought about that or aren't aware of some of the resources that are available to train them in that. And on one of the slides, just before the final slide in the handouts, you'll see a list of national organizations that actually provide great free resources on how to establish peer-mediated supports in local schools. So we'll make sure you have access to that as well.
Great, thank you. We are going to wrap up with one final question, which is, if you could make one recommendation, or what's one recommendation you would provide to a school getting started on improving belonging in their building?
I'll do it. I'll not obey the question and give kind of two pieces of that. One is, I think that when we actively reflecting on how we're doing in each of those 10 areas, that in and of itself ends up being a catalyst for starting to think differently about our practices and our collaborations and our postures. So I think that is probably one key piece, is simply to pause long enough and say, how are we doing in this area of belonging? And the second half of that is to also make sure that relationships are something that we think about, and work towards and collect data on in the same way we focus on academic rigor as well. To me, rigor and relationships go together. They're not competing interests. And so I think the more we're intentional about focusing on them and actually trying to measure progress in those areas, that starts to help us see all kinds of areas that we can move forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. We are just past 4:30, and so we will take this time to thank our participants for their great questions and participation, and again, for Dr. Carter for this wonderful session we've had today. There's some information here on the slides about ways to continue to stay connected to the Progress Center. And again, this presentation will be posted to our website shortly. Thanks to everyone for your participation today. We really appreciate the interest and your time. Have a good afternoon.